and thank you for the whole Connekt team for having us and having me today. I'm very excited to join you in your living rooms, wherever you are having lunch. Enjoy lunch, bon appetit. I guess that's one of the pleasures of the or positive side effects of COVID to a certain extent is that geographical distances, which is already close between Berlin and wherever you are in the Netherlands, is even closer in that sense, and we can just easily connect over the talk today. The topic that I would love to address, to talk about, is essentially defining a new mobility domain through collaboration. And I brought a few slides, but maybe to kind of set the stage a little bit why we talk about that topic and a different topic in that sense. For us as a team, and also me personally, we've been working for the past 9 years essentially on different mobility topics, usually related to data exchange, data collaboration in that sense, in what used to be the mobility industry. So for me, that meant Lufthansa Cargo. They're working with the board and the IT side, later then building an API platform, which is basically a data access platform for Lufthansa overall. I spent some time in research at MIT on the topic, working with a number of companies there. And then as part of that, also had a more extended stint with Uber, the ride-sharing provider, which also makes certain data and services available such that other partners can connect to it. And then back in 2016, we started putting together a team around what had previously been a hackathon tool, so more of a side project that had gained a couple of thousand users. And we started building a company around it. And through that, really with the vision of supporting this transition that we're seeing from what we traditionally described as the mobility industry to the mobility domain. And a core part of that transition essentially is that the players are different. Instead of defining mobility players as car companies or train operators and so forth, and then let's say you have the governmental sector and so forth, the mobility domain is shaped by those who provide mobility services, by those who govern mobility services, and by those who use mobility services in that sense. So the scope is much bigger, but it also describes the different level of collaboration that is actually needed. That's the topic that we're passionate about as a team. Would love to give you a bit of our thoughts on that, and then maybe use the second half of the conversation to address some of your specific questions around that. So for us, it all starts with a point or the realization that this new era of a mobility domain builds fundamentally on collaboration. And I already briefly pointed to that, is that you not only have a new form of collaboration between the existing mobility industry players, so let's say car companies and train operators and airlines in that sense start opening digital interfaces to share data such that the mobility experience for us as users, us as consumers, can be improved. But the pie is much bigger than that, because that's access to also programmatic access to the data from the different services providers is something that extends to governments, to city, regional, federal governments in that sense, to insurances, for example, and to a number of other services providers, which basically either contribute to mobility, let's say parking providers, infrastructure providers, or who benefit from mobility, such as restaurants, certain number of point of interests. So all of those areas can basically be seen within that mobility domain. And if we approach it from the perspective of how do you create the best experience for users, it's basically achieved by allowing come on. Sorry. Microsoft Teams is giving me a bit of a hard time here. Jump back to that. Sorry about that. So all of that collaboration at the end of the day is achieved through a number of different things. Where we started from is the technical interface side, but obviously there's much more to that. There's a regulatory framework in countries and regions like the European Union, in that sense, to support that data sharing. And there's obviously a strategic direction of all of the individual stakeholders to leverage that for their purpose. So what does that mean in the broader context, and also what's kind of the Xapix mission in that context? For us, we're looking at this specifically from the perspective of, let's say, a connected world. You may have heard of connected industries, in that sense, connected IoT. The connected world at the end of the day is bringing more and more connectivity to the different industry segments. And as you can see here, kind of from the evaluation that Bosch did, there's a huge investment going into the different areas, maybe a little bit lower now through the COVID impact. But it's a significant investment going into that, and at the same time, we see ourselves in a good path to shape that. At the same time, as much as you have investment, you also have challenges going with that, because on the positive side of having so much more data comes the challenge with needing to manage that data. So if you look at, this is a global number here, we're going to add 18 billion IoT devices in the next 5 years. So bringing that up from around 10 billion IoT devices today to 28 billion in 2025, which is an enormous growth of devices, of data, but also needs to be managed. Managing that, and maybe starting to manage that, oftentimes comes at quite a high cost for companies. So around 6 million euros is roughly the initial 3-year investment that mid to large size companies are taking to start building out the right tool set around that. And unfortunately, they're facing quite a low return on investment on a lot of these initiatives because of that high upfront cost. So let's think about the next step, which is moving towards a sustainable industry. And what does it take to achieve that? When I was at Uber, we set out this broader vision in that sense to essentially make transport available like running water. There was always the goal to have, let's say, a car or a mode of transport within 3 minutes around you. And if you essentially, let's say, at least for me, it was a very compelling vision. If you take that vision into the current context of us all moving individually, I think we can agree that it's actually pretty challenging for any transport services provider to reach that goal. both if you live in a city, even more so if you live in the countryside, or a city maybe that spreads a bit further out, because you need quite a lot of mobility services offerings there on the road to actually provide that to citizens. At the same time, it's a huge welfare component, because if you can ensure that, then you significantly increase mobility for people. But one of the key means of moving to that and achieving that from our standpoint is, first of all, data flow. And on a higher level, it's basically creating the right efficiencies and automation from that. And at that level of data, at that level of stakeholders engaged, this complexity will not be able to be manageable by humans, but rather by systems which are driving the decisions, but obviously humans helping provide the rules for that. Some of the specific examples there around what is happening, it's like cars and vehicles are getting connected in that sense. So this is the space of orchestrating telematics data, where fleet services providers are looking to connect to the different data streams and then power fleet management applications, power fleet maintenance applications with the data. But you also see that in let's say in other areas of kind of the transport experience, which again from a vehicle point of view here, you design a commute, and around the commute start linking to other points of interest. So this is kind of an example of the inclusion here of the other mobility domain companies in that sense, like parking, food ordering, grocery shopping in that sense, which all have touch points now to the traditional mobility industry. We can build a lot of AI, we can build a lot of machine learning models to improve the data, but at the end of the day, it all builds on the flow of data. Because if data doesn't flow, then the models are just a dry riverbed at the end of the day. And at the same time, we want to make sure that this flow of data is both easy, but also obviously reflecting the understanding of privacy and data protection that we have as European citizens. And I think it's fair to say that the GDPR, in that sense, in Europe has very much become a gold standard for privacy across the globe. Obviously, certain regions like China have a little bit of a different emphasis on how some of the benefit is, let's say, derived between the individual and the state or the collective. But at the end of the day, that is like overcoming and working along with regional privacy regulations is a key part of building a solution that is not only functioning locally, but that at the end of the day can work globally and can ensure that globally. And one of the means of achieving that to essentially allow the combination of flowing data, but then also triggering the right actions from that data is very much for us the cornerstone of our own vision of the company, which is basically we started from the data integration side, so connecting systems, connecting APIs to each other, but bringing in specific functions or in this case here, operationalized machine learning for different use cases. So this is both required to ensure that, let's say, there's the right privacy check conducted of data that's being exchanged now in the new mobility domain, but it's also required to help generate the right insights, the right predictions that are happening around where a user is traveling, or sharing the data around their their usual journeys, if they obviously if they consent to that, with the different stakeholders across the domain, such that they can improve their own offering as part of that. Quick technical deep dive here, how that can look like. Maybe some of you are working on topics in the machine learning domain as well. In machine learning, like the biggest problem is not necessarily to actually build the algorithm. The biggest challenge is actually to operationalize it and have the true data feed from the enterprise, from the partners, and then again drive the right actions in other systems. For us, that's kind of the core domain that we're looking at from a technical perspective, to then on a higher level allow the different companies, different services providers to actually trigger the right action at the right time. And to kind of touch and this last topic really briefly, we talked a lot about connections between players in the domain. Those connections are oftentimes referred to as APIs, so-called application programming interfaces. They can also be provided by other means, such as event streams, but let's stick to APIs for the moment. And we have seen in other domains that on the regulatory side, you can actually have a pretty strong push into that direction of openness. Some of you may be familiar with PSD2, the banking regulation in Europe, which mandated banks to open interfaces. I would say light forms of that have been introduced in the automotive industry as well, to open interfaces to vehicle, to telematics data. And around some of the developments, for instance, in the smart urban or real estate space, we can also see that there's a stronger and stronger focus of actually creating accessibility and interoperability between the different stakeholders, or companies, governments, and so forth, in terms of the data that is being collected and that may be shared. And at the same time, making sure that whatever is being shared is actually robust, reliable, and secure. Because you don't want to open a security backdoor in that sense into systems just because you're mandated to share something. You do want to put user privacy first for whatever you're sharing. And I think that is a key takeaway on this topic as well. It's not about data sharing in that sense. So connecting the dots does not mean that you take data from the left and you push data to the right. But it means that at the end of the day, you give other stakeholders access to certain insights. So let's take a very simple example. Someone wants to know what the weather is. You don't have to give them the full details of how much it rained and what the air pressure is and so forth, but rather give them the result of the computation that you have done internally, which said, right now the sun is shining. That's the only result that matters, and you can reflect that as well to a lot of the data that your companies or your organizations may be storing today, where what is being provided to partners is rather an insight. It's your expertise, which is flowing into that data versus the data itself, because that then also helps make the whole sharing element a lot more reliable and trustworthy. So for us, we started on this journey in 2016. There are a few of the companies that we're working with on here. There's a number of others also in the real estate and smart urban space, as well as on the governmental side, where we're working quite closely around some of the automotive platform topics in Europe in Germany with the government. And it's a space that we love. So I'm curious to hear your feedback on your thoughts on the topic as well. both in the remaining 10-15 minutes, but also feel free to connect with me, connect with us after the call, and always happy to discuss the different topics.
Thank you, Christian. I would love to hear some questions from the audience or remarks. So this is time. I think you can just go ahead and open your mic if you want to ask something.
Yeah, Christian, thank you for this interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you could be slightly more specific on solutions or services you've been working on, in the sense of getting the data, pushing them through its machine learning model, and providing that information as well. What your role as Xapix was in that process of being an enabler of that information?
Yeah. So let's take a look at a few examples there. One is for the companies that we're working with in the automotive industry, which car manufacturers, truck manufacturers. They're gathering real-time data from vehicles, which are zooming on the road. And one of the challenges for them is the different vehicle types are oftentimes sharing data with a different data model, sometimes with different interfaces. So they connect it through Xapix, they kind of harmonize the inflow. And then once they have data streaming, let's say in the right form, in that sense, it's about connecting and orchestrating this data together with other data streams, because you may want to pull in, let's say, internal product information or internal contextual information that the car manufacturer holds about the specific data that they can see in real time from the vehicle. At the same time, maybe you want to also integrate with external information around, let's say, weather, around traffic status, and so forth, before you actually then define certain triggers. So at the end of the day, what's the use cases that are usually being built around that are some more in the area of transparency. So predictive maintenance, getting an understanding when a vehicle needs to be serviced, maybe already creating that service event with a dealership or with a workshop. But also then maybe more towards the insurance domain, where you can essentially offer someone an insurance coverage, let's say for a specific amount of time, or for a specific event in that sense, that they need to be covered for. Or again, maybe more in the city context, looking at the service in terms of whenever you put your route in, the streaming data from the vehicle, you really have a good view of what's happening kind of in that vehicle capsule in that sense. But combining that with other related city data may actually help define a much more sustainable transport system. So there, I would say that the use cases sometimes get a little bit more fuzzy, because let's say the different providers are still very much exploring on what to do with the data, if they can monetize it, or companies like BMW have open sourced some data regarding to like pothole detection in the streets. But all those are examples where you usually see that it's not about a single data stream. It's rather around how do you bring together data from different areas beyond the traditional industry that then create value.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Christian, you started your presentation talking about the ecosystem. What are your thoughts about building that ecosystem?
I would say it's about energizing that ecosystem in a sense. I think all the you have all the players there today. The question is, how do they interact, and what is in for them at the end of the day, or what makes them interact. So while I'm not a fan of huge political restrictions, I do think that kind of an overall political aim to help shape those domains in that sense is beneficial. And we can see that, for instance, on a European level, on the related to the environmental and sustainability goals, which if you bring that to a tactical level, means that you first of all need to get transparency into how those different industries, so how real estate, how mobility, or transport and mobility and so forth are performing, and to actually realize then the efficiencies, or to improve it. It's about creating the links of that. I do think that there are different forums. Let's say there are political forums, there are let's say more organization-driven forums like standards bodies, which are extremely important, but unfortunately very slow to sometimes. And they come with a challenge that you have a standard by year 5 or year 6, but in the past 6 years, a number of companies already developed something and they didn't really follow a standard because there was no standard. And then you kind of end up with a mix of different ones, such that I think in these areas, if you actually have a little bit more regulatory push on, or a common understanding up front around, like, okay, here's what we want to achieve, and here is also kind of the means of how we enable that data share. This is extremely critical. And I see a lot of activity now on a European level there. There's an initiative called Gaia-X, for example, which is basically, they call it federated services. And they look at different industry domains in that sense, and are trying to help define, like, what are those services that we need around, let's say, automotive data, or around other areas of transport data, to really enable this whole slew of connected services that everyone talks about, but that's actually not that easy to realize if the different stakeholders haven't fully realized what's really in it for them.
Okay, last question. You see yourself as an enabler, right? In that matter?
Yes. Yeah.
So what do you need to push your ideas into this stakeholder system to help enabling this ecosystem?
So what would help us actually the most is an understanding that the individual stakeholders develop an understanding of what their role is in the future, and what their role in terms of, like, kind of an orchestrator, or maybe a governance mechanism is in the future, but also maybe as for a profit-seeking organization, what their business model is in the future. And for a lot of organizations isn't really that clear, especially when it comes to kind of the shift towards digital services, which is rather seen kind of as this big bubble, which will probably create a lot of revenue downstream for a lot of hardware-based businesses. But there's still little experience, and that basically causes the result that we're kind of in this zone of, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years where everyone is prototyping and trying out different things, but then they realize that the return on invest is actually low, or it takes a lot of time to realize that, so initiatives get stopped. And that overall impedes the system, because you don't have stakeholders aligned moving in one direction, but it's rather, we're all in experimentation mode, and some will essentially drop out or change their direction as part of that. And that's difficult if you are building a system based on trust, because you, at the end of the day, with sharing data, sharing APIs, or sharing insights, you also build on the trust that you will receive those insights from a different party. And if that party now changes their mind because they feel like they can better monetize in a different way, that's a problem. Because suddenly a critical input for your own system may not be available because someone else maybe has new leadership or new direction and changes the direction.
Okay, thank you, Christian and Hans, for your question. We are a little bit over time, so maybe in half hour is a little bit too short after all. But I thought it was very interesting, Christian, what you told us. So thank you very much for your presentation. If there's anyone who wants to reconnect with Christian, please let me know. We can provide email addresses and if needed. So Christian, thank you very much. And hope to see you again. Next month, we have a new startup, Citium. It's a Spanish company who is trying to achieve GPS for inside buildings like train stations, parking garages, and airports. So I hope that will be as interesting as this one. And if there's anything else, please let me know. And I want to thank everybody for his attendance. Have a good day.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.